Evelyn Marsh had learned early in life that survival on the frontier meant learning to disappear, to make herself small and useful and unnoticed within the household that had swallowed her whole the moment her father drew his last breath. She had been 14 when he died, coughing his life away in the back bedroom of the modest house he'd built with his own hands, and in the 2 years since, her stepmother Agatha had transformed from a woman of cool indifference into something closer to an overseer, extracting every ounce of labor from Evelyn that the girl's thin frame could provide while offering nothing in return but criticism and the barest scraps of food and shelter. Agatha had 2 daughters of her own, both older than Evelyn, both perfectly content to watch their stepsister scrub floors and mend linens while they occupied themselves with needlepoint and gossip, and neither of them ever spoke a word in Evelyn's defense when their mother's temper turned sharp. It was a hard, gray morning in early spring when Agatha called Evelyn into the front room and delivered the news that would append everything Evelyn thought she understood about her own worthlessness in that household. "You're to go with this man," Agatha said, gesturing toward a figure standing awkwardly near the door, a tall man with a weathered face, several days' growth of beard, and clothes that looked as though they had been slept in more nights than not. He held the reins of a mule loosely in one hand and would not quite meet Evelyn's eyes. "He's paid for you," Agatha continued, as though she were discussing the sale of a milk cow rather than a human being. $1, which is more than you're worth to me at this point, given how little use you've been these last months. You'll go with him and do whatever it is he requires, and you will not come back here." Evelyn stood frozen, the words settling into her slowly, disbelief giving way to a cold, hollow understanding that this was not a cruel joke but an arrangement already concluded, already paid for, already final. She looked at the man by the door. Thomas Hale, Agatha called him, though the introduction was delivered with such contempt that it sounded more like an insult than a name, and saw in his face something she had not expected: shame. He would not look at her directly, and when he finally did speak, his voice was low and rough, as though unused to conversation. "I'm sorry, miss," he said. "I didn't know the arrangement would be spoken of quite so plainly. I've got a daughter, 5 years old, and no wife to help raise her, and I was told there might be a girl here willing to help in exchange for room and board. I didn't come here to buy a person. I came looking for help, and I'll pay you honest wages once I've got them to spare. I promise you that." Evelyn studied him, this strange, weary man who seemed almost as uncomfortable with the transaction as she was, and found that whatever waited for her beyond that door could not possibly be worse than what she was leaving behind. She gathered the single small bag containing what few possessions were truly hers, a locket that had belonged to her mother, a spare dress, a hairbrush worn down to soft bristles, and walked out of Agatha's house without a backward glance, climbing up onto the mule cart beside Thomas Hale with a composure that surprised even herself, though inside she felt as though she were falling from some great height with no notion of where or how she might land. The journey to Thomas's home took the better part of a day, traveling along a rutted trail that wound through increasingly rugged country, and Evelyn used the silence between them to study her situation with the same practical clarity she'd applied to every hardship since her father's death. Thomas did not seem cruel, only tired, the kind of exhaustion that came from carrying too much alone for too long. He spoke little, but what he did say was courteous, almost painfully so, as though he were trying to make up through manners for the indignity of how their arrangement had begun. When they finally arrived, Evelyn found not the ramshackle homestead she had braced herself for, but a modest, well-kept cabin at the edge of a small, struggling farm, chickens scratching in the yard, and a little girl with dark curls running out to greet her father with an exuberance that softened something in Evelyn's chest despite herself. "This is Sarah," Thomas said, lifting the girl into his arms. "Sarah, this is Miss Evelyn. She's going to help us out around here for a while." Sarah studied Evelyn with the frank, unguarded curiosity of small children, then declared, "You're pretty," with such simple sincerity that Evelyn found herself smiling for the first time in what felt like months. That smile, small as it was, seemed to ease something in Thomas as well, and over the following days, Evelyn settled into a rhythm of work that, while demanding, felt entirely different from her labor in Agatha's house. There, her efforts had earned her nothing but further scorn. Here, Thomas thanked her for small things: a meal well cooked, laundry properly hung, Sarah's hair neatly braided, with a genuine gratitude that Evelyn had almost forgotten men were capable of expressing. She began to notice things about him that contradicted her first impression. The careful, patient way he taught Sarah her letters in the evenings by candlelight, the gentleness with which he handled the farm's aging horse, the quiet dignity with which he bore what was clearly a difficult, uncertain existence without ever once taking his frustrations out on either her or his daughter. What Evelyn did not know, and what Thomas made no effort to reveal, was that his circumstances were not quite what they appeared. Thomas Hale had once been one of the wealthiest ranchers in the territory, owner of a cattle operation that had spanned thousands of acres before a combination of drought, a devastating cattle disease, and the sudden death of his wife in childbirth had unraveled his fortune and his spirit in the span of a single terrible year. He had sold off most of his land to cover debts, retreated to this small, unremarkable farm at the edge of his former holdings, and told almost no one in the surrounding territory who he truly was, partly out of grief and partly out of a bitter pride that could not bear the pity of former associates who had once courted his favor and now, he suspected, would only whisper about his fall. He had gone to fetch help from Agatha's household not because he could not afford proper wages, but because his remaining resources were tied up in a slow legal untangling of his late wife's estate, resources he fully intended to access again once the paperwork cleared. And he had simply wanted, for the first time in a year, someone reliable to help him keep his daughter fed and cared for while he rebuilt what he could. Evelyn, of course, knew nothing of this history, and assumed based on the modest cabin and Thomas's threadbare clothing that he was exactly what he appeared to be, a struggling homesteader barely keeping his small farm afloat. This assumption, rather than diminishing her regard for him, deepened it, for she watched him work from dawn until dark without complaint, watched him deny himself the last portion of stew so that Sarah and Evelyn might eat their fill, watched him fall into bed each night bone-tired and rise again before sunrise to do it all over. She had never known a man to labor so selflessly for the well-being of others, and slowly, without quite realizing when it began, she found herself caring for him in a way that went beyond gratitude for having been rescued from Agatha's house. Weeks passed into months, and the farm, though still modest, began to show signs of quiet flourishing under their combined efforts. Evelyn had a gift for stretching what little they had, and Thomas found himself increasingly astonished by her resourcefulness, her uncomplaining resilience, the way she had transformed his and Sarah's chaotic, grief-stricken household into something that, for the first time since his wife's death, felt almost like a home again. He began to find reasons to linger near the kitchen in the evenings rather than retreating immediately to his own work, began to notice the particular way afternoon light caught in Evelyn's hair while she worked in the garden, began to feel a warmth toward her that unsettled him precisely because it reminded him how thoroughly he had believed himself finished with such feelings after his wife's death. It was Sarah, in her innocent way, who first gave voice to what both adults had been carefully avoiding. "Papa," she said one evening apropos of nothing, "are you going to marry Miss Evelyn? Because I think you should. She makes you laugh, and you didn't used to laugh at all." Thomas had nearly choked on his coffee, and Evelyn, standing nearby, had gone crimson and busied herself intensely with the dishes, but the words hung in the air between the two adults for the rest of that evening, impossible to fully dismiss. It was around this same time that the legal matters concerning Thomas's late wife's estate finally resolved, and with them came the restoration of a portion of his fortune. Not the vast holdings he'd once commanded, but a considerable sum nonetheless, along with the deed to a substantial piece of land he had not touched in over a year. Thomas found himself faced with a decision. He could reveal the truth of his circumstances to Evelyn now, risk her feeling betrayed by the deception, however unintentional, or he could continue as they had been, and lose the chance to build something honest with a woman he had come, quite unexpectedly, to love. He chose honesty, calling Evelyn to sit with him on the porch one evening after Sarah had gone to sleep, and told her everything. His former wealth, his wife's death, the ruin that had brought him to that small cabin, and the legal resolution that now restored to him land and money he had not touched in a year. He watched her face carefully as he spoke, bracing for anger, for a sense of having been misled, but what he saw instead was something closer to relief, as though a piece of a puzzle she had not realized was incomplete had finally clicked into place. "I don't care what you have or don't have," she told him, when he finished. "I never did. I only wondered why a man who worked himself half to death for his daughter's sake seemed so at peace with having so little. Now I understand it wasn't peace with having little. It was simply love, doing what love does regardless of circumstance. That's not something I need explained or excused, Thomas. That's the very thing that made me care for you in the first place." Thomas, undone by her generosity in that moment, took her hand and told her plainly what he had been too cautious to say before. That he loved her, had come to love her steadily and completely over the months of their shared labor and shared home, and that whatever wealth had been restored to him meant far less to him than the prospect of building a genuine family with her and Sarah. Evelyn, who had arrived at his door as property purchased for $1, found herself weeping now for entirely different reasons. Tears of a joy so overwhelming it left her briefly speechless before she managed to tell him that she loved him too, had loved him for longer than she dared admit even to herself. They married that summer in a small ceremony attended by the few neighbors who had come to know and respect Thomas Hale during his quiet year of rebuilding, none of whom had any notion of his former wealth until whispers began to spread following the wedding. Whispers that grew into astonished admiration once it became known how the humble homesteader they'd befriended was, in fact, one of the territory's formerly great ranchers, now rebuilding his fortune with a wife who had once been sold to him for $1 and had, in the process, become the truest wealth he possessed. As for Agatha, word of Thomas's restored fortune reached her eventually, along with the news of his marriage to the stepdaughter she had so casually discarded. And though she made several transparent attempts to re-establish contact once she understood the scale of the family's returning prosperity, Evelyn declined every overture with a politeness that left no room for negotiation, having learned long before that some doors, once closed, were better left that way. Evelyn and Thomas's ranch prospered in the years that followed, rebuilt not to its former scale but to something Thomas found he preferred. Smaller, more carefully tended, filled with the laughter of Sarah and the siblings who eventually joined her, and grounded always in the memory of how their family had truly begun. Not with wealth or status, but with two people finding in each other, amid hardship and uncertainty, a partnership neither had dared hope to find again. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe for more powerful frontier love stories. Your support keeps these tales alive, and there are many more journeys of resilience and love still ahead.